Isolated from the rest of Hyrule, the Faron Wetlands is a rather uninviting destination, populated by the mistrustful, trend-seeking Deku scrubs. Though adorable, the Deku people can be ruthless and selfish in their efforts to chase the latest big thing. When a rift opens up in the wetlands, they develop a community-wide obsession with cotton candy made from spiderwebs. Ugh. On her quest to mend the rifts, Zelda finds herself thrown in prison for disrupting the supply chain. But after something of a prison escape, the princess comes into possession of a membership card, granting her access to the Scrub's sweet spot. From here, we can enter the expanding rifts and a journey through the still world, where we'll find the next dungeon. Welcome to Faron Temple, arguably the best dungeon in the game, or at least it's in the top 3. But before we spend any time inside, we have to look at the temple exterior, because the surrounding still world area is just as much a part of the dungeon as the rooms inside are, even more so than Gerudo Sanctum. Taking cues from the Skull Woods dungeon of A Link to the Past, a large part of the dungeon exploration here leans on exploring outside and finding different ways into the various sections of the dungeon. And it's great. There's even a room fully dependent on this, with no connecting hallway through the dungeon exterior. This exterior area also offers a nice counter to the inside of the dungeon. Instead of dark, cramped corridors, it's a big open space, and rather than containing clear puzzles, it's packed with enemies and obstacles. Those various entryways into the dungeon are nicely hidden as well, with really only the main entrance into the dungeon's central room being obvious. The rest, while not too hard to find, get tucked into various corners or underwater or even behind webs and statues. By my count, there are 7 entrances, though that doesn't mean the dungeon is disjointed or segmented. Aside from that one previously mentioned isolated room, the dungeon weaves together, interconnected like a tangled web of rooms, branching out of a notable central chamber with doors on all sides. The architecture is okay, nothing to write home about. It definitely evokes ancient jungle temple though, with stonework falling into disrepair, swaths of green, and plant overgrowth everywhere. I don't necessarily find it extraordinary, but I still like it a lot. I think I have a soft spot for jungle and forest-themed dungeons in general though. I like the greenery, though I think I've been starved for this type of dungeon theming a bit, since neither Breath of the Wild nor Tears of the Kingdom really had any sort of forest temple. That said, it also finds ways to visually stand out through its use of lighting. We'll find several rooms cloaked in darkness, requiring us to navigate in low visibility and find torches to light. I've said this in previous videos already, but I always love when dungeons use darkness like this. It just adds another layer to the navigation and the overall tone, and it is used to great effect here. The atmosphere is wonderful and mysterious, which is conveyed both through that deep-rooted sense of exploration and that careful use of darkness itself. It all reminds me a bit of Woodfall Temple from Majora's Mask, actually, which likewise had a lot of flowery Deku architecture, dark rooms, and plant overgrowth. Contributing to those wonderful vibes is the dungeon music. This is a great track, one I've been enamored with while writing this script. Maybe it's my love for percussive instruments, but the layered marimba and gamelan just suits this ancient temple perfectly. It's so jungle dungeon. And then there's a flute that floats over top of it to add this layer of curiosity. Just feels so meticulous mysterious. There's an old feeling, like something lost to time, but somehow it's also optimistic in a way. It doesn't have the tango swagger that Elden did. That track made me want to get out of my seat and just dance. Instead, there's something more immersive about this one. There are so many layers and tones and bells and chimes. I feel enveloped by the instrumentation. There's so much happening in this song without it feeling overwhelming or busy. And even when it takes a moment to remind you of the dangers found within the temple walls, it'll always come back around to that feeling of intrigue. Now, I'm not an expert in music theory. I can only outline for you the feeling that I get from this track. So if you want to hear a more technical breakdown of this song, I'll refer you to this wonderful video by Cadence Hira, hopefully I'm saying that right, which picks the song apart and examines it through a more trained lens. Links are down below in the description, but it is so worth the watch. More than any other dungeon in this game, Faron Temple feels to me as though it fully embraces exploration as an important theme, and this is evident right away. If you follow this mysterious moving plant through the front door, you'll be greeted only by an impassable shut gate. In the first room, the dungeon is telling you, go explore, look around, and figure it out yourself, because you can't just follow the main path through here, and I mean that in the best way. That said, they tease you with the boss key right away here, giving you a pretty solid objective, before putting the gate between you and that big, enticing treasure chest. So what this means is that you have a solid idea of where you need to go, but figuring out how to actually get there is left up to you. I love that. Furthermore, this feels to me like where they've finally hit the mark on a dungeon that is mostly open and non-linear without feeling cheesable. Where Jabul fell short, this dungeon manages to let you run wild and cover a lot of ground, while also adding in a few deliberately placed locked doors and keys to find, which makes that exploration actually meaningful. I think this is the biggest dungeon in the game, spanning 4 floors, containing lots of side-scrolling passageways and a fair-sized exterior area in addition to its own interior footprint. It's a big dungeon. After Elden especially, which felt too short, this is definitely a step in the right direction. Despite that heavy exploration focus, the dungeon isn't lacking in good individual puzzles, including a number of them that make use of these scales, a mechanic we've seen a number of times in the series, some use of reverse bond to fight through water currents, and perhaps most notably, these puzzles in which 2 switches must be pressed down simultaneously. I've heard of a number of ways to get this done, though I've always defaulted to using Armos and good old timing. But that's the sort of puzzle that this game excels with, where there's some room to play around with it and figure out different ways to do it. And it especially gets good when they start combining these puzzle mechanics, placing Armos on top of those scales or even underwater. There are also these green electric switches, with whatever given room usually containing a handful that need to all be activated within quick succession. As a puzzle mechanic itself, it isn't that groundbreaking, but they do find some neat ways to use it, including putting it in a room full of moving platforms. Neat stuff. And the dungeon gives you several different echoes that you can use in conjunction with these. What surprised me the most upon further examination of Faron is that there are only 3 small keys here, but those keys, and especially those locked doors, are placed so well, so effectively, that it always felt like more to me. The locked doors block access to the dungeon mid-boss, this door towards an optional chest, and then this critical side-scrolling passageway, which will take us towards a rematch with that mid-boss. That second key and locked door is the only real weak spot here for me, especially since the key is found so close by to that locked door, and all you get out of it is a golden egg. But the other 2, brilliant placement, because the dungeon is still otherwise sprawling, open, and interconnected, but progress through the dungeon is gated by exploring and getting those keys, so you can hunt down that mid-boss and ultimately get the boss key. Speaking of that mid-boss, they're first teased to us outside the dungeon, before speeding off into the temple with the boss key in their possession. The first time we'll encounter them for real is behind this very important looking locked door off the central room. It's Manhandla. Yes, that Manhandla from Zelda 1. It's awesome to see them make a main series return. They've only appeared in the original NES Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, the Four Swords games, and Hyrule Warriors if you want to count that. Though I guess you could argue that the Big Baba from Twilight Princess is pretty similar. Aside from perfectly fitting the dungeon's theme, Manhandla feels like just the right choice to pull from the series' history. Iconic, but not overused. They look great here too, distinguished from the Deku Babas sprinkled throughout the dungeon and Faron region beyond, but still leafy and organic. The first fight will limit Manhandla to 2 heads, while the rematch later in the dungeon will use all 4, with the 2 new blue ones being a little stronger. Manhandla's weak points are on their necks, or stems, branches. I'm gonna go with necks. So you can either stun a head and rush into attack, or pull at their heads with bind and have an echo dish out damage. There are probably more strategies that I haven't even thought of, but those two both feel satisfying from a gameplay standpoint, honestly. They will try to chomp down on you, and can even swallow your toughest echoes whole, but it's pretty fun to use this to your advantage and feed them bombfish. I really enjoyed this mid-boss. It's not super challenging, but I felt myself just having a great time and feeling enticed to try out different echoes and tools from my kit to see all the ways to deal damage. Defeating them the first time will cause them to flee, while our second victory will reward us with the boss key. So, all that's left to do is head towards the boss door. If you haven't found it already, that is. With all of that said, we can now confront the dungeon boss. Bursting from a tangled mass of webs is this game's version of Goma. Here we go. There have been many iterations of Goma over the years. Like Manhandla, Goma was first introduced to us back in the original Legend of Zelda, but unlike Manhandla, she's had lots of main series appearances with designs that have varied, though usually keeping to the theme of being some kind of arthropod or arachnid, but not quite a spider. Twilight Princess's Armagoma leaned the most in the spider direction, with this game coming in a close second. Even the Deku Scrubs refer to her as the Great Spider here. I personally tend to prefer other games' interpretations of Goma as being something a little more unique, Ocarina of Time's being a personal favorite, but I think that's just a general feeling that giant spider with big eyeball feels a bit on the generic side to me. That said, I won't dock them points this time around for 2 reasons. One is that the big eyeball weak point, as overdone as it is, has always been Goma's thing, ever since the NES days. It's a core part of her identity as a recurring boss. The second reason is that while I may find giant eyeball weak points to be a bit overused in the series as a whole, in the context of this game itself, it just isn't. Goma is the only boss in Echoes of Wisdom that falls into this trope. So combine those 2 factors, and I find it doesn't actually bother me, especially comparing this to the Goma of Link's Awakening, a game that shares its art direction, and I can see a sort of continuity between those little guys and this big one. Though maybe I would have liked it a little more if the baby Gomas that she hatched during the fight, and that you can learn as an Echo before the dungeon itself, resembled that classic design a little more closely. Otherwise, Goma looks like Goma. I don't know how else to describe it. As for fighting her, the battle feels pretty nicely telegraphed and follows a pretty standard sort of combat flow. Goma has 3 crystals on her body, which need to be activated with electricity. Activating all 3 will stun her, so you can get on top of her body and strike her big eyeball to deal damage. Pretty much much what you'd expect, but I'd like to highlight how the game teaches you to use electricity for these crystals just before the dungeon. It's a clever moment where the first time you see one of these is in this cave with these buzz blobs, which are nearly guaranteed to activate this first switch for you, and then you have to activate the other switches in the room on your own in order to unlock the door. Then the dungeon itself keeps building on the mechanic with different room layouts, as I mentioned earlier in the video. This ends up all culminating in these switches being built into Goma herself, essentially adding a puzzle mechanic from the dungeon into the boss fight, and giving a reliable way to stun her and open her up to attack. It's the closest a boss in this game has felt to having that classic dungeon item integration, without it actually being a dungeon item. Though you can also bypass these crystals entirely with a well-timed shot directly to the eye using your bow. Pretty much exactly like the Ocarina of Time Goma fight with its slingshot, or even more like the Twilight Princess version when you take her big laser into account. Overall, this is a pretty good fight. Maybe not an incredible one, and one that feels a bit like it's playing it safe, but it does the job and succeeds at being fun and engaging, which is most important. It's always a treat to see Goma though in some form or another. Ganon aside, she might be the most iconic recurring boss in the entire series. So overall, Faron Temple is solid, and a strong contender for being named my favorite dungeon in this game. It wonderfully embraces that sense of exploration that, in my view, sits at the heart of what makes the best Zelda dungeons as good as they are. Faron Temple balances free open exploration with linear dungeon progression in a really elegant way. Even though there are only a few keys and locked doors here, with only 2 of them being mandatory, they're used sparingly, but really effectively. There are lots of branching paths and open space to explore, both in and out of the temple itself, with very little hand-holding. Try doesn't backseat. They instead ask you, where do we begin? You're given free rein to explore and unravel this dungeon yourself, and I love that. I love getting lost in a dungeon. In fact, as a testament to that navigational emphasis, this is the only dungeon in the game where I've actually found myself using those warp points. They've been present in every dungeon of the game, but I've never bothered with them aside from in this dungeon. Faron is downright labyrinthian too, with a layout that winds and twists back in on itself and seemingly goes on in all directions. Even on repeat playthroughs, I still find myself spending a great deal of time just exploring, checking where every door leads to, though for whatever reason, the map placement always throws me off. I always take a long time to find it, despite seeing that it is placed rather logically near the central room. Maybe it's because my instincts take me left instead of right when I start exploring, but that's me. I do like how far you can get in any one direction before finding a key or the map though. But that central room with Manhandla's little trail of buds marking the way acts as a great little anchoring point for your exploration. Though while you can wander for a while in any direction, it never ends up feeling aimless to me. Mapping the place out itself and exploring feels so worthwhile, since those paths loop into each other and connect. Even if a room isn't critical, because it's so rarely a dead end, I still feel like I'm making progress. Since the dungeon exterior is a natural extension of the navigation itself, that exploration focus feels even more interesting, adding another plane on top of the existing 4 floors of the interior. Plus, Skullwoods was one of my favorite dungeons in A Link to the Past, and this feels like something of a callback to that, which is always neat. Faron Temple really has it all. Great music, tons of optional goodies and secrets to collect, a moody atmosphere with its use of darkness, fun puzzle mechanics, a wonderful sense of freedom and exploration, deliberate, meticulously placed locked doors, and some really fun combat scenarios. I have a hard time finding any faults here, aside from Goma being a little predictable, but even then, it's a fun enough battle that almost doesn't matter. In the end, Faron Temple succeeds in pretty much every way. In the context of Echoes of Wisdom, or even just the series as a larger whole, this is an awesome dungeon. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon, the names of which you're seeing on screen right now. You all are awesome. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.